On February 20th, 2026, three things happened to one man in one day. At 10 in the morning, the highest court in the United States told him he had broken the law. By noon, he had signed a new executive order doing the same thing, using a different legal authority. And by evening, he gave a foreign government 10 to 15 days to reach an agreement, or face severe consequences. Three fronts, one day, one decision maker. And what almost nobody is connecting is that these three events are not separate stories. They are one story. And the next 15 days may determine the direction of the global economy, the future of American constitutional authority, and whether the largest regional confrontation since 2003 begins. I am going to take you through each event in sequence. And then I am going to show you the connection that ties all three together, because that connection is the real story, and it is the part that will affect you directly. Let me walk you through what happened. Because the sequence matters, the order matters, and the timing is not a coincidence. At 10:03 in the morning Eastern Time, the highest court issued a 6-3 ruling. The president had exceeded his authority. The sweeping trade levies he had imposed on nearly every country on earth, using a 1977 emergency powers law, were not legal. Over $175 billion had been collected from American importers under that authority. The court said none of it was authorized. Chief Justice John Roberts, a conservative, wrote the majority opinion. He was joined by two justices the president himself had appointed, and by all three liberal justices, 6-3. The most significant legal defeat of this presidency, the centerpiece of the administration's economic agenda, gone in a single ruling. Markets surged, Democrats celebrated. The European Union called it a victory for the rule of law. Canada's trade minister said it vindicated their position, and the president stood in the White House briefing room, visibly furious, and called the justices who ruled against him a disgrace to the nation. He said their decision was an embarrassment to their families. He thanked the three dissenters for their strength, wisdom, and love of country. And then he signed a new executive order, a 10% levy on all countries, effective February 24th, using Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a provision that allows a baseline charge of up to 15% for 150 days. The Treasury Secretary stated publicly that the revenue would be virtually unchanged. The message was clear. The court can invalidate the legal basis, but the policy survives. Different box, same outcome. But the details beneath that headline are more significant than the headline itself. Section 122 of the Trade Act has a hard ceiling, 15% maximum, 150 days maximum. After that, the authority expires. The president cannot renew it unilaterally. He would need Congress to pass new legislation, or he would need completed investigations under other trade statutes, which take months and face legal challenges at every step. So what he signed on February 20th is not a permanent replacement. It is a bridge, a temporary measure with an expiration date. And the clock started on February 24th, which means by late July, the administration must either have a new legal framework in place or the baseline levy disappears entirely. Meanwhile, the $175 billion collected under the now invalidated authority remains in limbo. The court sent the refund question back to the lower court. No process for returning the money has been created. No timeline has been set. The president, asked about refunds at his press conference, said it would result in 5 more years of litigation. Small businesses that brought the original lawsuit, companies with 10, 20, 50 employees that spent the past year absorbing cost increases they could not pass on, immediately called for a full, fast, and automatic refund process. One business owner said he had been in a constant state of worry since the levies were first imposed. The founder of a cycling company in Vermont said his supply chain would take months to recover. But the government has signaled it does not intend to return the money voluntarily. $175 billion, collected under an authority the court has declared illegal, and no mechanism to give it back. That was Act 1. Now here is Act 2, and this is where the story turns. On the same day the court delivered its ruling, the president addressed reporters and pivoted to foreign policy. He said a particular government in the Middle East had 10 to 15 days to reach an agreement on its enrichment program. Or there would be, in his words, unfortunate consequences. He had said something similar before. In June of last year, he said he would decide within 2 weeks whether to take direct action. He made the decision 2 days later. Now he was setting another clock, 10 to 15 days, starting February 20th, which means the window closes between March 2nd and March 7th, 2026. While that clock was announced, the largest regional positioning of American naval assets in years was already underway. One carrier group was already fully operational in the Arabian Sea, conducting daily sorties south of the coastline. A second, the most advanced vessel in the fleet, was transiting from the Caribbean toward the region. Analysts estimated the full positioning would be complete within days. This was not rhetoric. This was infrastructure. You do not move two carrier groups into a region to make a point. You move them to have options. And the timing, announced on the same day as the most humiliating legal defeat of the presidency, has not gone unnoticed by analysts. A professor of international relations at the London School of Economics told reporters that domestic challenges could speed up the decision to act abroad. When a leader suffers a major domestic setback, the incentive to demonstrate strength on the international stage increases. This is not new. It is one of the oldest patterns in political history, and the convergence of a landmark court defeat with a compressed timeline for foreign action is precisely the scenario that makes observers nervous. Now here is Act 3, because February 20th was not over. The next morning, February 21st, the administration announced that the new global levy would not be 10%. It would be 15%, the maximum allowed under Section 122. In less than 24 hours, the rate had been raised by 50%. No new legal basis, no new emergency declaration, no new consultations with Congress. Just a higher number. The executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, the busiest port in America, told reporters that hiring has been light, investment has been weak, and economic growth has slowed. He said it is very difficult to plan strategically when you do not know what the rules are going to be. He predicted a bumpy road ahead and said consumers would see prices increase. He was not alone in that assessment. The National Retail Federation, representing the companies that sell most of what Americans buy, had already warned that higher import costs translate directly to higher shelf prices. The cost increase is not theoretical. It shows up in the price of clothing, electronics, furniture, auto parts, building materials, and food packaging. Every product that contains an imported component, which is nearly every product, carries the cost of these levies inside its price tag. The average American household was already paying roughly $1,000 more per year under the previous rates. With the court ruling removing the IEEPA levies, that number was projected to drop to about $400. But with the new 15% rate under Section 122, the relief may be temporary, or may never materialize at all if additional authorities are invoked. Manufacturing, which the administration promised to revive, shed 108,000 jobs in 2025. Factory managers described morale across the sector as very low. The Institute for Supply Management reported that the majority of factory managers who responded to their surveys said levies had been a drag on their operations, not a stimulus, and the promise that domestic production would replace imports has not materialized at scale. Building a new factory takes years. Training a workforce takes years. Establishing supply chains takes years. Levies operate on a timeline of days. The mismatch between policy speed and economic reality is the fundamental tension that the administration has not resolved. And now, with the legal foundation of its primary trade tool demolished, the timeline for resolution has gotten even shorter. And the average American household is already paying an estimated $400 more per year in higher costs from levies that remain in place under separate authorities. Now pause, because what I am about to explain is the thread that connects all three events, and it is the part that most coverage is missing. The court ruling removed approximately 2/3 of the administration's trade revenue in a single morning. The IEEPA levies, the ones struck down, were projected to generate $1.4 trillion over the next decade. The remaining levies under other authorities are projected to generate $635 billion. That is a gap of roughly $765 billion over 10 years. The new Section 122 levy, 15% for 150 days, is a temporary bridge. It cannot close that gap permanently. It expires in late July. To replace the lost revenue, the administration needs either new legal authority from Congress, which is politically uncertain, or completed investigations under Section 232 and Section 301, which take months and are subject to court challenges at every step. This creates an enormous incentive problem. The revenue pressure is real. The political narrative of strength is under threat. The court just told the world that the president overstepped. And in the middle of all of this, a foreign policy confrontation offers something that a court ruling cannot. A stage, a demonstration of decisiveness, a headline that replaces the one about constitutional limits with one about national resolve. I'm not saying that is the calculation. I am saying the structure of incentives makes it possible. And every analyst watching this situation is aware of that structure. Now, let me tell you why the next 15 days matter more than any period in recent memory. The enrichment program timeline is real. American officials say the program has moved closer to the threshold than at any point in history. The administration wants full dismantlement. Not limitations, not monitoring, but complete elimination. The foreign minister of the country in question responded by saying they never accept ultimatums and that the program is a sovereign matter. The Defense Council stated that their delivery systems are a red line, non-negotiable. Meanwhile, the country's supreme leader told supporters not to protest the talks, and then added that the talks are merely a delay until broader objectives are achieved. The gap between what each side considers an acceptable outcome is enormous. One side wants total dismantlement. The other side considers its program a sovereign right and its delivery systems untouchable. That is not a negotiating gap. That is a structural incompatibility. And when structural incompatibility meets a 10-day deadline backed by two carrier groups, the space for diplomacy narrows very quickly. The indirect talks, held through intermediaries in Oman and Geneva, have produced no framework for agreement. American officials have expressed open skepticism. The Secretary of State said he was not sure a deal could be reached. The Vice President warned that other options remain on the table. The Foreign Minister of the country in question said his government never accepts ultimatums and that diplomacy cannot be conducted through deadlines or pressure. But the positioning continues regardless of what either side says publicly. The previous direct confrontation between these two countries in June 2025 lasted 12 days. It degraded the other side's air defenses and delivery systems significantly. Since then, they have been rebuilding. And the concern in allied capitals, particularly in Israel, is that continued diplomatic engagement could give the other side time to restore capabilities that were diminished. Israel's Prime Minister visited the White House on February 11th specifically to raise this concern. His argument, every day of negotiation is a day of rebuilding. The Allied position is that the window for effective action is closing, and that a deal which merely formalizes the current situation without requiring dismantlement would be worse than no deal at all. This creates a pincer dynamic. Allies are pushing for action. The other side is refusing key demands. The deadline is compressing. And the domestic political landscape, reshaped by the court ruling, creates additional incentive to demonstrate resolve on the global stage. Now bring all three threads together. Thread 1, the court ruling has weakened the administration's domestic economic authority and created a revenue crisis that Section 122 can only bridge for 150 days. Thread 2, the foreign policy ultimatum creates a deadline between March 2nd and 7th in which either a deal is reached or action becomes likely. Thread 3, the rate increase from 10 to 15% in less than 24 hours signals that the administration is willing to push every available authority to its maximum, regardless of process, precedent, or institutional constraint. Each thread alone is significant. Together, they describe a presidency operating under simultaneous legal, economic, and geopolitical pressure, with compressed timelines on every front. And here is what most people do not see. The 150-day clock on the trade levies expires in late July. The foreign policy deadline expires in early March. The refund litigation from $175 billion in collected duties could take years. These are not parallel tracks. They are converging tracks. The decisions made in the next 2 weeks on the foreign front will affect the political calculus on the trade front. A successful foreign agreement would give the administration a narrative of strength that offsets the court defeat. A confrontation abroad would dominate headlines and push the trade story below the fold. And an extended diplomatic stalemate would leave the administration fighting on three fronts simultaneously, in the courts, in Congress, and in the Middle East, with diminishing leverage on each. Every country negotiating trade deals with the United States is watching this convergence. The European Union, whose 15% rate under the previous deal was wiped out by the court ruling, is recalculating its position. China, whose effective rate may have dropped from 36% to roughly 21%, is recalibrating. Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, every country that spent the last year negotiating from a position of weakness now knows the legal basis beneath those deals was invalid. They paid levies the court says they should not have had to pay, and the replacement authority expires in 150 days. That is a massive shift in global leverage, and it happened in one morning. Let me put that in specific terms. The European Union had agreed to a 15% rate as part of its deal with the United States. That deal was built on IEEPA authority. The court just invalidated that authority. The deal is now legally groundless. The EU is recalculating, and their Trade Committee chair called the ruling a positive signal that the era of unlimited and arbitrary levies may be ending. China's effective rate, which had been as high as 100% on some goods, was reduced to around 30% through a series of agreements. Analysts now estimate that with the IEEPA levies removed, China's effective rate may drop to roughly 21%. That is a 40% reduction in trade costs, achieved not through negotiation but through a court ruling that China had nothing to do with. South Korea, whose exports to the United States account for a significant portion of its GDP, noted that even with the new 10% rate, major exporters in semiconductors, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals would be paying less than before. But automobile exports, which face separate 25% levies under a different authority, remain unaffected. Canada's trade minister said the ruling vindicated his country's position that the IEPA levies were unjustified from the beginning. Mexico's president said that despite all the pressure and rhetoric, Mexico had ended up in a relatively privileged position. And Japan, Brazil, and India, all of which had separate bilateral arrangements, are reassessing their positions in light of a legal landscape that shifted in a single morning. Every one of these countries now enters the 150-day window with more leverage than they had 24 hours earlier. Because the replacement authority is weaker, the rates are lower, the duration is limited, and the precedent has been set. Emergency powers cannot be used as a permanent trade tool. The question is not whether this week matters. The question is whether any single week in recent American history has carried this many simultaneous inflection points, legal, economic, and geopolitical, converging on such a compressed timeline. I do not think it has. The Constitution says Congress sets levies. The court just confirmed it. The president signed new ones anyway. A foreign government has been given days to accept terms it calls unacceptable. 2 carrier groups are in position. $175 billion in refunds are unresolved. And every trading partner on Earth is recalculating its strategy based on a legal landscape that changed overnight. This is not 3 stories. It is 1. And the next 15 days will determine which direction it breaks. If you want to understand how these threads connect and what happens when the clocks run out, make sure you are following this channel, because this is the most consequential convergence of pressure this presidency has faced. And it is happening right now. The last time an American president faced a simultaneous constitutional crisis, trade disruption, and foreign policy ultimatum on a compressed timeline was arguably 1973, when the Watergate investigation, the oil embargo, and the Yom Kippur situation all collided within the same quarter. That period reshaped the American presidency, the global energy market, and the architecture of Middle Eastern diplomacy for the next 50 years. The convergence of February 20th, 2026 may not reach that scale, but the structural parallels are difficult to ignore. A president under institutional constraint, economic pressure building, a foreign deadline ticking, and the temptation to use one crisis to distract from another. What happens in the next 2 weeks will reveal whether this administration can manage 3 simultaneous pressure points, or whether the pressure itself becomes the policy. If you want to understand how these threads connect and what happens when the clocks run out, make sure you are following this channel. Because this is the most consequential convergence of pressure this presidency has faced, and the countdown has already begun.